Jack, it's great to have you here today. Thanks so much for joining us. You've done so much work over the years in looking at the essential role food plays in creating a healthier, more sustainable future. You've also spent a lot of time examining the critical impact of food production and consumption on the planet. Where do you think that British farmers, the people that are listening to this, where do they fit into all this? And what part can they play?
Well, I think in order to understand sort of the part they can play in the future, it's useful for us to think about where we've come from. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate how far we have come. Just as an example, if we were farming today with 1960s technology, we would need 1 billion additional hectares of land to feed the world. Well, that's more than a quarter of all the forests on the planet only exist because of improvements in agricultural innovation and management practices. And so I think that farming has played a huge role in creating a more sustainable planet and has the potential to do that going forward as well. And so I think that we forget that farming is getting better every day. It's wildly more sustainable than it was 30 years ago. It will be wildly more sustainable 30 years from now. And really, what we need to do is we need to invest in innovation to accelerate that pace of improvement.
And what role do you think technology has got to play in this? Because this is something that's really hotly debated at the moment. And I know you're going to be debating it even more so at the Low Carbon Agriculture Show next month as well. So just that piece about kind of tech innovation and how the industry is progressing forward.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that challenges those of us who are working in the agriculture sector or farmers working sort of in the field is that, innovation is part of what they're doing every day. They're innovating in seed technology, planting technology, management practices, data science, drones, all sorts of new and innovation. But, for most people, innovation is more challenging. And so it's hard for them to appreciate just how important it is. I often say that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And there's no place that people despise change more than in the food they eat, because food is what brings us together with friends and with family. And so if people mess with our food, they're messing with our family, and people don't like that. So we need, though, to be able to convey how important it is to have innovation so that we can avoid having even more dramatic changes in our lives. And that sort of goes back to the point that I was making about how far we've come. And innovation is absolutely central to that. And so what we need to think about is, you know, what are the range of possibilities that are out there, and how do we ensure that consumers actually are demanding those innovations? Because right now I think there's some fear in terms of what might come. And so I think that there needs to be more conversations with the consumers so that we can have those advances. There are all sorts of exciting things that are coming along, whether that's gene technology or advances in fertilizers and biofertilizers. And I think data is going to continue to provide more and more information to help farmers be the best that they've ever been. And these are all things that we should be excited about, in the same way that we're excited about the latest smartphone or app or things like that. But if people don't understand it, they're not going to support it. That's why I always say, people, well, science tells us what we can do, but it's the public that tells us what we should do. And we need them to understand and appreciate its importance if they're going to give us, or they're going to give farmers the freedom to use those new innovations.
Yeah, I mean, your billing actually ahead of the Low Carbon Agriculture Show next month says that you'll address this role of that communication can play in reducing the polarization in this conversation around food, because this is something that we've seen really hot up in recent years, haven't we? You say that if we can close a gap between consumers and producers, agriculture might just save the planet. How have we got communication all wrong? Why is this debate so polarized? And is it more polarized now, or does it just feel it?
I think it definitely is more polarized now. I don't think that it's really because we've gotten communication all wrong in the past. I think in the past, mostly consumers just didn't care about it. So the challenge we have is that consumers have never cared more nor known less how their food is produced. And so because they care so passionately, they're asking for changes. But because they don't necessarily appreciate how it was produced in the past and the implications of the things they're asking for, it may not actually deliver what they want. And so I'll give you an example of how I think about this. Like I think for most consumers, when they think about sustainability, they're imagining that, if a farmer uses less pesticide and less fertilizer and less herbicides and less water and fewer inputs, then that makes them a better farmer. And the reality is that you probably will have a smaller impact on that piece of land if you use fewer inputs. You might have less erosion, you might have less eutrophication of the water and runoff, but you'll also produce less food, right? Because there is a reason that farmers are using inputs, and it's to increase productivity and outputs. So what I call this local sustainability. In other words, the benefits of that light touch agriculture are felt locally, but the impacts are global because somebody somewhere else has to make up the difference. And so there's more land grown somewhere else or used somewhere else. And what I call global sustainability is that intensive type of farming where you're using more uh, machinery and insecticides and maybe herbicides and all sorts of things. You may have reduction in soil health, you may have some compaction, you may have more erosion, but you're producing a lot. And so the impacts are local and easy for people to see, but the benefits are global because the UK doesn't have to import as much food. Somebody someplace else doesn't have to make up the difference. And so it's not really about good and bad and right and wrong. It's about sort of this continuum from local sustainability to global sustainability. And there will always be trade offs between the two. They're not good and bad. It's just choices and consequences. And we see this difference in maybe how the US focuses on more of that global sustainability. And Europe that's more focused on local sustainability. We see it in the farm to fork strategy that's calling for reductions in pesticide use, reductions in fertilizer use, transitioning to more organic production. So you can very clearly see that. And the European Commission then says that if fully implemented, the farm to fork strategy would lead to a 15% reduction in food production in Europe, which is massive. That's a lot of food. And so somebody else, someplace else, has to make up the difference. And Brazil is the number one food exporter to Europe. So that means Europe is exporting its environmental footprint to arguably the most biodiverse country on the planet. So that's choices and consequences. And so I think that, as we have these debates across the UK on whether or not we should be planting more trees versus, producing land sparing versus land sharing, we need to think about the choices and the consequences and the trade-offs inherent in those choices.
You talk there, Jack, about choices and what consumers care about. Do you think that they care enough about this stuff to actually pay more for the food that is produced to these higher standards and to this more more environmentally conscious way of farming and producing food?
Well, sadly, I like to say that people won't change what they eat to save their lives. Why do we think they'll change what they eat to save the planet? Uh, so I think that is a challenge. But I think we also need to recognize that consumers do want it, even if they're not willing to pay for it. And food companies will respond to that desire, even if they're not willing to pay for it, by pushing those obligations down through the supply chain. And we also have governments that are making commitments in terms of sustainability and climate and net zero that are going to create commitments. And so the problem is that lack of additional income that in order to be able to deliver that. And so I think that's part of a conversation with the entire food supply chain to ensure that it's not the farmer who gets squeezed in order to deliver that. So I think that's one set of concerns and one thing that we need to keep in mind. But the other is that it's actually possible to improve in terms of sustainability and improve income. And I'll give you an example. We often, if we were having a conversation about climate change and sort of CO2 emissions, here in the UK, the per capita emissions is about 5.5 tons of CO2. And for some who are involved, that probably seems like a lot, and it seems like the UK is a problem. It's higher than the global average. But if you look back and you see where did the UK come from in terms of emissions? Well, 5.5 tons, that's a 150-year low for emissions here in the UK. So, things are dropping, rapidly, and they're moving in the right direction. We just want it to happen faster. And we have here in the UK, you've improved GDP by 40% in the last 30 years, and you've reduced emissions by 40% in the last 30 years. So it's absolutely possible to improve sustainability while improving the bottom line. And so we need to keep that in mind. And we need to help the consumer to understand how far we've come so that then they appreciate it. Instead of beating up on farmers for not doing more, the question is, how can we help farmers to do more? And that's a very different conversation.
And in terms of creating a market for that, for this stuff and that kind of more sustainably produced food, it's often said that we need like a cultural shift around food and how, how do we change those behaviors? Where do we start with that?
And so I think there are two parts. I mean, one is we need to understand the footprint of the food that's being imported into the UK, because it's one thing to ask UK farmers to deliver on sustainability, and it may hurt their bottom line in the short term, and then to push that production someplace else. But we shouldn't be pushing it somewhere else if it ends up having a bigger environmental footprint in that other place. And we won't really know that if we don't understand, the emissions of things that are coming into the country. And it may turn out that it makes more sense to be producing these things here from an emissions perspective, and we need to ensure that they continue to be produced here in the UK. About 50% of the food is consumed here in the UK, and we might need to try to grow that. Now, some of it's challenging because a lot of things that are imported are not produced here in the UK. But I think that number one country for exporting food to the UK is the Netherlands, and I'm pretty sure they're growing most of that stuff in greenhouses. And I think you could produce greenhouses here. And so we should be thinking about, again, what could the future look like? But I think that in terms of getting the consumer to be willing to do that, there also needs to be more of a focus on seasonal and local, because they deliver benefits that go beyond just sustainability. They support the local economy. So we need to be a little bit careful about having just like a single metric of what good agriculture looks like. And sort of going back to the earlier point that I made about land sparing versus land sharing, the diversity of the food system is actually part of its strength. So, we shouldn't be talking about should we do one or the other. The real question should be, are there certain areas that are very sensitive environmentally where we should have that land sharing aspect and have a lighter touch, or maybe not farm at all? And are there other parts of the UK where we can afford to actually be more intensive in our food production? And so, how do we get that balance right? And that balance is going to be different in the UK than where it would be in the United States or in France or other places. And so, again, it's a decision that people need to make for themselves, and the UK needs to set for itself. But we can't just look at sort of net zero in isolation. And I worry that some regions in the UK are very focused on delivering net zero, and they're not thinking about offshoring that environmental footprint, which may undermine their ultimate goal. Because if they make global emissions worse by achieving net zero here, we really haven't achieved anything. And having zero food production in the UK is not the same as having a zero environmental footprint for food in the UK.
Just on that point, I mean, food security has just never been as unstable, I guess. We saw it in COVID, through supply chain issues. We've obviously seen it with the war in Ukraine and other conflicts overseas. Do you think that, well, what are your thoughts on that, first of all? And also, do you think that the UK government takes food security seriously? And does the nation of the UK, in your opinion?
So Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of interest in more local and national food production as a result of COVID. I think it raised questions about the vulnerability of our global supply chains. Uh, but I think we also need to be careful that we don't learn the wrong lessons from history. Uh, Having global supply chains, if a port has a problem, or if a foreign export market has a problem, that can lead to domestic problems here. But if the problem is here instead of in those other places, and you don't have global supply chains, then that could be much, much worse than the problems we had in the past. And there are a lot of calls for having greater inventory now because the lack of inventory led to empty store shelves. Well, having inventory can help to reduce those short-term shocks. But inventory is also slack in the food system. In other words, it's a drag on the economy every day in the off chance that someday you might actually have a problem. And so, it makes all food more expensive to have those stocks. And so, again, it's really about making sure you get the balance right, not swinging too far in the other direction, not the wrong direction, because of a past problem, because you don't know what that next problem is going to be. Uh, and so that's just something to keep in mind. And I think the UK government is definitely thinking about this. They have a call out for funding right now on resilient food systems. And, in many ways, these are exactly the kinds of questions they're asking about. How does policy on climate change impact trade? How does the impact on trade affect food safety? How does the conversation around food safety impact sustainability? And I think that's the right thing to do. We need to be thinking about the trade-offs and achieving different goals. Uh, the UK is better than many countries in terms of the amount of food that's produced here. I think the UK produces something like 70% of the food that it could produce here. So it may be producing about 50% of the food that's consumed, but it's about 70% of what could be produced here. And that's pretty good compared to many parts of the world. I think though we need to think about not just what's happening here, but how other regions are going to change. For example, one of the largest exporters to the UK is Ireland, and so there's beef that's exported here. Well, the Ireland is going through its own conversation around, what should the future of farming look like, and there have been calls for a 10 to 20% reduction in livestock in Ireland. Well, if that happened, it could end up, dramatically reducing beef exports from Ireland. Well, if you're not producing the beef in Ireland, and if you can't produce the beef in the UK, then your choices are to consume less, and people don't like that, or to import more from places like Brazil. And so I think, we need to just keep in mind that, the choices in other places are going to impact the UK just as much as the choices in the UK will impact those other places. And so I'm glad to see that the government is thinking about this now, and hopefully they balance those things and any policy recommendations that come out of this.
That was my next question about policy, and it is such a fine balancing act, isn't it, in balancing all this stuff. Do you think that the direction of travel in terms of the agri-environment schemes, coupled with the grants to improve tech innovation, sustainability, do you think it's moving in the right direction in terms of policy?
Well, I think the piece that's missing is really thinking about the global trade-offs. So I think that there is more and more of a conversation around domestic trade-offs, but I think that's just not good enough because if the UK were to rewild 15% of agricultural land, and if they were to shift another 15% to agroecology, and if the UK were then to dramatically improve its landscapes and move itself closer to net zero in terms of what's produced here at the expense of the global environment. I'm not sure that that would be a choice that one would want to make. And so I think that there needs to be more of a recognition of that global trade and what are the UK's contributions to the global impact, and what are um, the trade-offs inherent in having 50% of your food imported. Now, a lot of that's coming from countries close by, and some of them are reasonably good in terms of the production they have. But the world will need 25% more food by 2050, and so there's going to be a strain on a lot of these food systems. And to some extent, it would be better for the UK to be exporting more food instead of some of the other countries that are more likely to actually increase exports. And so, there is a model in which more intensive production here in the UK could contribute to reductions in global emissions at the expense of domestic emissions. And so there hasn't been much of a conversation about the trade-offs in that, and what would be the value, because most of the global agreements are very much focused on domestic emissions production within borders and not across borders.
Where do you think that the UK, you've done so much research looking at this all over the world, where do you think the UK actually stacks up in terms of sustainable food production? Does it rank fairly highly?
Well, it does in terms of the emissions production here. I think where there's been some disappointment is just in increases in productivity over the last decade or so have not reflected, I think, some of the investment in agriculture here in the UK. I think some of that's inherent in sort of the recent decisions to merge 3 of the 4 agri-tech centers, that perhaps they haven't delivered as much, or at least we haven't been able to measure the benefits as much as we would like. And I think that that's something we actually really need to keep in mind, that if the UK is going to invest in these technologies, it has to be with the idea that there will eventually be a return on that investment. Now, some of those investments should be, basic science with no obvious immediate result, but a lot of it needs to be focused on what are the outcomes going to be. And I've seen in universities where a lot of this research is happening, often they measure impact in terms of how many grants have they received instead of how many lives have they changed. And so universities, as partners to the farming community and the government, we need to do a much better job of measuring impact in terms of lives changed and environment changed. And some of the new system for scoring universities takes into effect or impact. And I think that's a great transition. And I think it's been slow to come here, everywhere. But we're beginning to see a recognition that, it should all be about the impact, whether short-term impact or long-term impact. But, we have to be able to quantify that.
There's a frustration, isn't there, not just among the the researchers and all this fantastic work that goes on in our world leading research centers, but with farmers on the ground as well. They want to be able to use this on the ground to benefit not only their businesses and their bottom line, but looking at a whole nation approach. What needs to happen to get this really great thinking and all these innovations down to grassroots level?
Yeah, well, I sometimes say that I'm a science optimist. I'm sort of convinced that science and technology and innovation can help us get where we need to go. But I'm a bit of a regulatory pessimist, having spent 13 years in the US government, about whether or not you'll be allowed to use those tools and innovations. And so, Brexit creates an opportunity for the UK to accelerate the access to new technologies. The gene editing law, suggests that there's sort of an appetite for taking advantage of that. And I think it remains to be seen whether or not that promise ends up delivering actual technologies on the ground. The UK has, created a lot of technologies that have gotten to be used in other places and not necessarily here. And so there are PRRS resistant pigs that are likely to be commercialized in the United States, as early as this year. That haven't, as far as I know, haven't really started the regulatory process in the UK, and there's zero chance that they would ever be approved in Europe in the near future. And so, that's a shame. There have been avian influenza resistant chickens developed, at the Roslin Institute and other places. And so there's a lot of amazing research coming out of the UK. And if, as a researcher, you find that it's impossible to bring products to market, at a certain point, you just sort of move on to new things and new problems, or new places, because, I think most researchers in the end want their innovations to have impact.
Yeah, that's why they're doing it, right? Yeah, for the greater good.
I think that it's an exciting time for agriculture, and I guess the thought that I would leave the listeners and viewers with is that we've got this enormous challenge, of producing 25% more food by 2050, but we often forget sort of what comes next, and the challenge we have is not to produce more and more food forever. After 2050, populations growth slows dramatically. We've already reached peak child. The number of children born next year will be less than this year, and the year after that, and the year after that, everywhere in the world. And so, the challenge we have is to get to 2050 without cutting down our forest, without draining our rivers, our lakes, and our aquifers. Because if we do, in many ways, we actually will be good forever. Every day between now and 2050, it gets harder to feed the world. But every day after 2050, it will get easier to feed the world. And so, the challenge we really have is, just to deliver in these next 30 years. And if we do, that's where I say, agriculture will in fact save the planet. And, the sort of to emphasize that, I guess my final point would be the next 30 years, they're not just the most important 30 years there have ever been in the 10,000-year history of agriculture. And they're the most important 30 years there will ever be. And that's why we need to get it right. And that's why this conversation is so important. And that's why the work they're doing is so critical. And that's why we need the consumer to appreciate the consequences of not allowing innovation to deliver on that promise.
Jack, thank you so much. That's been so inspiring and insightful. We thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.